afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Blavatnik. I'm a finance professor here and the faculty director of the Corporation Society Initiative is sponsoring this event. I don't know whether I need to introduce CASI every event, but briefly, the name suggests what CASI is about, and I see in the front row and here some of our student leaders and our staff being Lisa and Tina in the back, a new one, and we have even our departing staff, project manager Loretta here. I'm very, very pleased to have here today Karthik Ramanna, an all-time friend, not exactly on this issue, but he's very broad. Karthik was a accounting professor at Harvard Business School. And so he belongs to a small club of business school professors at various fields that somehow have kind of gone out of their silos and worry about these big picture issues and drifted into leadership or into politics and lobbying and capitalism and democracy and all of that. So he belongs in that. In fact, he wrote a book in 2014, which is how we first met, called the Political Standards, which is about the politics of accounting standards setting, FASB. The MBA students learn accounting. That's how the sausage is made. And who's in the room when they set these rules and what their interests are, and he coined the term thin political markets. And that was the title of a session in a conference that he and I organized back in 2020, in December 2020. Just reflect on that time. It was by Zoom, and it was called Corporations and Democracy. And he was part of a panel called Thin Political Markets about expertise in policy and conflicted expertise and things of that sort. But today he's here about his book today, and his book that just appeared called The Age of Outrage, How to Lead in a Polarized World, very timely. And meanwhile, all we talk about is his work on carbon disclosures and all his amazing work on that, which we'll discuss later, but not today. Today, CASI leader Jack Shumway, is going to have a conversation and then your engagement with Karthik, who's hailing from Oxford, Blavatnik School of Government, so he's no longer in a business school, and came here after stopping in Chicago in a similar center and more like CSI, and spending the meeting and engaging. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming to the second event of the year for CASI, the Corporation Society Initiative. Before we begin, I'd like to note that we have some 15 minutes set aside for Q&A at the end, so I'll ask you to please hold your questions until then. And I'd also like to thank Karthik for being here today. We greatly appreciate you returning to California, I think after just having been here a couple days ago and then flying to Chicago and flying back. So we appreciate the time you spent on a plane for us. So to kick things off, you are obviously an author, having just published a book, but you're also a professor at the Blavatnik School at Oxford. So before we get into your book, I think it'd be great to share with the audience a little bit about the Blavatnik School's mission, how it contrasts with your time at HBS, and how it helped maybe inspire the book.
Fabulous. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here again at Stanford. I think the last time I was giving a talk was on the book, the previous book, which is called Political Standards on the Phenomenon of Thin Political Markets, and I always enjoy my time here. I was at Google 2 days ago doing this talk, and then unfortunately had to fly back to Chicago before I came back here. But it's such a pleasure to be at Stanford that I couldn't think twice about the offer from Anat to join you guys. So about 8-9 years ago now, I was first contacted by a headhunter for the opportunity to serve as the first director of the Master Public Policy program at the newly created Blavatnik School of Government. And I remember talking to a number of people because I had no connection with the Harvard Kennedy School. I was, as Anat mentioned, a professor at Harvard Business School. And so I thought maybe they'd made a mistake. Said maybe there's another Professor Karthik at the Kennedy School and they just got it wrong, but there wasn't. So I talked to a few people and they said, oh, you should put your hat in the ring and see what happens. And then, long story short, I was offered the role. And I remember talking to someone who's a very senior leader at the Kennedy School about whether I should take that opportunity. And this person had served in a very senior leadership capacity there. And he gave me great advice. He said, Karthik, there are only a handful of great universities in the world, this being one of them. And the opportunity to be at the beginning of something, to help create something, that's something that comes very rarely in your career. So if you can get in on the ground floor, and this particular faculty had been there at the founding of the Kennedy School, he said there was a magical moment around that. And so that's what brought me to Oxford. It was it's been a tremendous experience and a tremendous ride. The thing that most contrasts is, so teaching at Harvard Business School, I think at the time about 2/3 of my students were American and 1/3 were international. There may be more international students there today. But notwithstanding that, the ethic in the classroom was definitely the American ethic. And you could hold certain truths to be self-evident, right? And including the fact that if you were in a business school, the pursuit of business is a good and noble thing that will help us advance human flourishing. So I arrived as this transplant from what is sometimes called the West Point of capitalism to the Blavatnik school. And there were as many students from China as there were from the United States. There were in that first year, I think, more students from Russia than they were from the United Kingdom. And so it was just this tremendously diverse group. And one student said to me, the wonderful thing about the public policy program at Oxford is that there's no such thing as an international student. And because it's just this sort of, I think in that first year, there were 120 students from 70 different jurisdictions. And so you couldn't hold any truths to be self-evident. I remember in the first year, because we were sort of trying to sort of engage the students in government and in student government. And I said to the students, it'd be good if you sort of organize some elections and elect student leaders. And then I had a group of students come to me after class to my office and say, what is this election thing? Why don't you just appoint the leaders? So, things that we would hold self-evident weren't necessarily sort of self-evident in different societies. And that presented both a tremendous learning opportunity as well as, quite frankly, was terrifying. Because I said, oh God, they've made this bet on me. I don't know what I'm doing. And at the very least, by convening all these public leaders from around the world, these are people who we hope will go on to become presidents and prime ministers. And certainly many of them are in very senior leadership positions, cabinet ministers, chief secretaries in the civil service, mayors, governors, et cetera. And at the very least, we should do no harm. But hopefully, we also do some good, right? So aspirationally, we should be doing some good. And so I did what many academics do when they don't know the answer to something. They teach a course on it. So I offered a course called How to Lead in a Polarized World. And I didn't know the answer to it. I was very forthright with the students. Look, I have no clue what the answer is to this question. But let's work on it together. Let's try figure it out together. And what I did was, Oxford terms are very short. They're 8 weeks long. So I reached out to 8 friends of mine who were either, the rule was no consultants, no bankers. They had to be CEOs or COOs. They had to run something, right? So, and they came from business, from government, from the not-for-profit sector. So one of them was the head of one of the largest university hospital systems in Europe. One of them was the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police of London. One was the CEO of a very large sort of business. One was the CFO of the Tata Steel Group. And so, just brought these guys because they were running something really sort of substantive. And I said, bring to me your biggest challenge in this age of polarization. But, a la Socratic method, don't tell us what you did. Just bring the problem. And then let's have the class sort of work out the problem together. But also bring your favorite piece of reading. And this could be anything. It could be an academic article from a journal. It could be, something from the Harvard Business Review. It could be a poem from Shakespeare, whatever you want, but bring your favorite piece of reading as well. So that was the first sort of corpus of this course. And it was just 8 interesting conversations. There was no framework or anything like that. But over time, we taught that several iterations, and it got to a point where it became a required course in the curriculum. And then, for reasons that perhaps we'll talk about in this session, after a few years of doing this, I decided I needed the space to step back because it's just one of those things where it's all-encompassing. It takes a lot, and you have to be on all the time. And I knew that if I tried to do it one more time, I wouldn't be as on as I should be, right? You should never do more harm than good in these kinds of roles. So I needed to take a step back. And so I said, but we're ashamed to lose all of the sort of momentum and energy that we've created in this. So I wrote a 10,000-word essay, and I sent it to my editor at HBR. And he said, this is great, we'll publish it, but it's too short. And we should turn it into a book. And so I worked with him, and that's where the Age of Outrage, How to Lead in a Polarized World came from.
That's fascinating. It's interesting to hear how having such an international group sort of brought you back to first principles and not taking any of those assumptions for granted that maybe you did at Harvard. So moving on to the book then, you begin the book with the story of Disney and how CEO Bob Chapek, whose muted response to the quote-unquote don't say gay legislation led to internal criticism at Disney. But your book isn't an argument for leaders to take a specific kind of stance on certain issues in big moments. Really, you describe it more as a framework for handling these kinds of controversies in the intermediate and the long run. Could you elaborate a little bit on the ambition of the book and what you hope leaders can gain from reading it?
Yeah. It's a great question. So I think one of the core premises of the book is that managing in the age of outrage is not managing outrage. So managing outrage is crisis management. It's, in some sense, we're good at it. We know how to do it. We might bring in some PR skills at it. It's an element of firefighting, right? It's got an element of firefighting associated. Managing in the age of outrage, there are two things to note about it. First, that some of the outrage we're talking about is very legitimate, and depending on the perspective of the constituency you're dealing with, you may not politically agree with it, but they take it very, very personally. And so treating it as a PR issue you can spin your way out of, it is not going to, in the long run, make the problem go away. So you need to have a more holistic way to think about this. The second is, if you approach this through a firefighting lens, then you'll constantly be in firefighting mode. And you can't afford to do that. You need to be in fire prevention mode, but more importantly, you need to do all the things that as an organization leader you have to do in terms of advancing human flourishing, your mission. If you're a for-profit business, you have to think about economic growth and sources of innovation and so forth. So how do you create the space to do all of that in the context of this deeply polarized world and this age of outrage? That's sort of the central premise of the book. And it is very much a book about the how rather than the what, right? So the strategy that Disney has to adopt in this world is very different than, say, the strategy that Exxon would adopt, because they're in very different businesses and they have to approach this very differently. But the book is really about how you arrive at that strategy and how you then put that strategy into place. And of course, there's a whole question about values as well that I don't directly engage in, because you're going to bring your own values to it. And you've got courses here in the business school that will help you navigate that and so forth. So, but it's a how book. Yeah.
So moving on to the actual how then, there's a 4-part framework that you introduce in the book, and it's rooted largely in behavioral science and some other areas as well. Without giving away too much of the book, could you talk a little bit about that 4-part framework and its interdisciplinary nature?
Sure. So at the core of the framework is actually something I call turning down the temperature, right? Because if you're dealing with this in an animated state, if you're dealing with this when you're triggered into an aggressive state, then you're very unlikely to do good. And I write that chapter from the perspective of the manager turning down her or his own temperature, as opposed to the manager, so because there's a tendency of managers to see everybody else as outraged and them as somehow sort of, beyond it all or above it all. But look, we're all human and we're all likely to be prone to aggression. And so let's start with ourselves as sort of the. And the science of aggression actually provides nice insights into how, you might navigate this. So simple things like, how might ambient conditions provoke you? And what are the ambient conditions that really provoke you? So that you as a manager are self-aware of them, and then you're able to sort of put yourself out of those conditions. So that's sort of one simple trick. But also thinking, we tend to think of ourselves as very cognitively sort of engaged, and especially if we're in leadership positions, we're rational people that will look at the evidence and weigh on it, et cetera. But of course, a lot of how we interpret the world is a product of what, in that literature is called knowledge structures, that we might call lived experiences or scripts. And so these are, in some sense, think of it as axioms. So yes, we might be rational and logical, but we're rational and logical within the context of a certain set of maintained assumptions or axioms, which are the product of our knowledge structures or lived experiences. So how do you ensure that that bias doesn't lean into what you think of is a cognitive response? And one way you do that is by creating a group of people around you who have different knowledge structures, who have different scripts, but who you trust and they trust you enough to speak truth to you. Right? And that's something that often we don't do, because we might do one or the other. We might, of course, have close friends who we can sort of, download with, but they might actually be very similar. They might have they might bring the same biases. So it's actually doing both of those things, where you bring people who are very different from you, and yet people who you trust to do that. And then, so when I was running the Master of Public Policy program at Oxford, I would notice that all the students from Australia would study together, and all the students from Colombia would study together, and all the Brazilians would study together, and so forth. And I said, but actually, what you want is groups that actually study across those differences, because that's where the trust is built, and that's where the real learning will come from, because you'll see these things differently. So that's sort of one sort of, but that's the core part of the framework, which is this turning down the temperature. And then beyond that, it's a book that explores, as you said, there are 4 further parts to it, which explores how you would go about creating active listening communities so that you can understand what's really going on, how you might think about what are the parts of the problem that you bite, and what are the parts of the problem where you say no. Because companies often, and organizations often make mistakes with biting off more they can chew, then they overcommit, and then, or they might ignore something that they shouldn't be ignoring, which was the Disney case. And then, how you put that in practice, because implementation is really important. And then the final part of it is really about resilience, right? Because the idea that somehow you as a leader have to be heroic and always there and always on, that is not very resilient. So how do you build this in your organization so there is tremendous sort of redundancy and capacity to handle these issues? So that's just a very quick tour of the framework.
Thank you for giving that overview. You spoke about axioms as part of that. There were 2 axioms that you mentioned pretty early in the book that I thought were incredibly valuable for level setting what leaders can expect when responding to a politically charged environment. The first is, no matter what you do, you can never address the demands in front of you. There's always going to be someone, at least, who sees your response as insufficient. And then second, you cannot and should not see yourself as the whole solution. So with these 2 axioms in mind, what do you think success really looks like as a leader, possibly using the examples of Oxford or the London Metropolitan Police Force from your book as an example?
Yeah, so basically the first principle is you're not going to, don't try solve the whole problem, because the factors behind this age of outrage are so complex, they're so they draw on so many problems in society. If you think that somehow you're going to solve this all, you'll very quickly exhaust your organization's capacity to do anything else. And secondly, don't think of this as a popularity contest. Don't expect to be liked, even if you're doing the right thing, if you think you're doing the right thing. Because, the world is deeply polarized. And if you have a sense of perspective that you might do the right thing, but still come out of it as the bad guy, or that helps you somehow deal with so it's to give you a sense of humility and perspective because of the nature of the problems and the nature of the divisions we're dealing with in society. I'll give you an example of I think a leader who sort of maybe embraced this quite well. And of course, this is an inductive framework, so which is to say the leader was not aware of these axioms. They did it, and then we were looked at 40, 50 different cases before we sort of were able to see some patterns there. But this was a person who was the chief medical officer of Oxford University Hospitals. And Oxford University Hospitals is a very, like, one of the top research hospitals in the world, certainly one of the largest in Europe, and a very sort of, complex place to run, as you can imagine, with any hospital system that has, all these sort of Nobel Prize winning type scientists on board and top surgeons and so forth. And you're managing, and of course, there in the UK, even a hospital system like Oxford is part of the public NHS system. So, so you're sort of, you're managing across both public and private interests, and of course, the hospital system had to deal with a COVID pandemic, like much of the rest of the world. And this particular, she was then the chief medical officer of the hospital system, and she's since been promoted to CEO of the hospital system. And she was brought in quite unusually. She was the first woman to be in that role. She was the first person of color to be in that role. She was also the first person born outside the UK to be in that role. But perhaps most importantly, in the context of Oxford, she was the first person who didn't have an Oxford degree who was brought into that role. So that tells you something about, right, there was a condition under which you bring such an outsider into such a it's this hallowed institution which is producing all of its talent from within. And part of the challenge they were facing when she was brought in was the hospital, in the year before she was appointed, had 7 never events. Right? So a never event is like when you operate on the wrong limb. That should never happen, hence it's a never event. So they had 7 of those, which is of course 7 too many. And so they bring her in, and part of what she does is try to first figure out what's going on in the culture. And part of what's going on in the culture is there's this big disconnect between, say, there are many disconnects, but one of them, for instance, is a disconnect between, say, surgeons and the staff in the, like the nursing staff in the operating theater. So there are checklists, but of course, if you're this super bright surgeon, fellow of the Royal Society, et cetera, when the nurse says, here's the checklist, let's start with the surgery kind of thing, right? And so how do you empower that kind of communication is part of what the challenge is, what she's trying to deal with. So she creates these what she calls patient safety huddles, where every morning the groups have to get together and they have to talk through what their objectives are, and they have to, right? And of course you can imagine, especially those of us who are academics, when something like this comes, we'd say, what the hell are we doing, et cetera. But she said, no, we have to do this. And in the first year, they make some progress. So they go from 7 never events to 2 never events. Staff morale, particularly outside of the sort of surgical community, sort of goes up. For those of you who are in orchestras, they say violinists are the sort of hardest people to deal with. And in hospital administration, surgeons are like the violinists of an orchestra, right? They're the top of the food chain, they're the hardest to manage. But so people are starting to get to a place where they feel like they can challenge a surgeon if they're not following a checklist. And then of course the pandemic hits. And as you know, in the early part of the pandemic, you've got a situation where there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't have enough PPE or personal protective equipment. We don't know how infectious this virus is. We don't know how what kind of testing we need and so forth. There's all this uncertainty. And then the prime minister, at the time it was Boris Johnson was the prime minister, he goes on radio and I think he says that all elective surgeries must continue. Right, and he's not crazy to say this because part of what they were worried about was there would be this there's a pandemic of uncertain length, and there would be all this buildup of elective surgeries, and then this would create a huge capacity problem in the medical system. But the problem is that this news is delivered, kind of top down, and then the surgeons, some of them at least, threaten to revolt. They threaten to not follow the order. And because this is sort of part of a public healthcare system, the chief medical officer is, the NHS uses this horrible term called gold commander. And she is the gold commander for this district, and that means she has sort of almost military-like authority to, right? And so she's given this, some members of her team say, you need to enforce this. This is now is the time, because as you can imagine, as this outsider, there's great skepticism of her leadership and so forth. Now is the time to sort of clamp down and show that you're in charge, et cetera. And then someone else on her team says, and this culture change, there's no time for it. You've got to sort of put that aside. And of course she says, hell no. If the culture doesn't work in this moment, then what are we building it for? right? So she does something quite remarkable. She turns over the decision making to the surgeons, explaining to them that their authority, and by virtue of being Oxford, they will have a sort of a profound impact in shaping how every other surgeon in the country will behave as well. So she puts them in that position, and she gets them to sort of make the decision. It's an enormous gamble that she's taking, but in this particular case, it pays off, and the surgeons backed out, right? So there's that sense of perspective of saying, look, this is not a problem I can solve, and this is not a problem that I ought to be solving, right? And of course, in turning it over, she will take this huge risk, and some people might resent her for it, and people certainly at the top of the NHS administration might resent her for it, because it sets the sort of, they would hope to sort of just control everything very tightly. But she said, look, if we're building this culture, we're building it for precisely this moment. Because I remember on the day we were we kind of shadowed her, just to see what her a day in her life looked like. And the day we were doing that was March 17th, 2020. And she was receiving 200 emails every 30 minutes, right? And no human being can, because there's so much anxiety, right? No human being can process that. And she says, there's something very wrong if we think that we can go through a pandemic of uncertain length with the idea that someone will manage 200 emails a minute. And of course, as you go higher up the food chain, there will be even more of that. So we've got to create a new way to approach it.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, and it must take a lot of bravery to stick to the culture of an organization that you built in those kinds of moments. Feels very topical these days. We've seen a couple examples lately when a top-down decision, potentially motivated by politics, isn't aligned with an organization's culture. Of course, in the book, you talk about Disney and Florida's legislation, but more recently, there's been some high-profile examples of this with the LA Times, which for the first time isn't endorsing a presidential candidate, and with the Washington Post, which saw a number of its senior editors quit the organization after it made a similar type of decision. Could you elaborate a little bit on the relationship between a company's culture and the impact of top-down decisions during moments of crisis?
Yeah. So I'll give you two quick examples. One is Disney, and then one from Google, just because I was there 2 days ago. So Disney, whether it likes it or not, it's just part of the political zeitgeist, right? I mean, what Disney princes and princesses do in the cartoons today, that's going to shape the culture of America tomorrow, and indeed of the world tomorrow. So it's hard for a company like Disney to say, oh, we don't do politics. That just doesn't, that's their business. And it's different if you were, say, Exxon. I mean, obviously they do politics as well, but their product is not the same, it doesn't have the same sort of cultural salience that Disney's does. And they can, so there are different strategies. It's not like Exxon can be completely divorced from it, but they could take a different strategy. So part of what was happening at Disney was they had, of course, this very LGBT affirmative approach. They used to run this thing called Gay Days or they still do, I think, Gay Days at Disney and so forth. And at the same time, they had also a very progressive creative approach to creative talent and so forth. And then the, Ron DeSantis is running for a Republican presidential nomination, so he decides to sort of push this Don't Say Gay bill through the Florida legislatures. And Disney's response is, oh, we don't do politics kind of thing. And that gets the CEO into tremendous amounts of trouble because you've sort of set expectations that you're going to be LGBT progressive. You've sort of promised that implicitly to your customers. You've promised that implicitly to your creative talent and to your employees. And then when things get rough, you try to back away. So that gets him into enormous trouble, and he tries to make a donation to HRC, which is this LGBT group in Washington. And of course they say, no, we're not interested in your money. That's not what, So, and eventually he ends up losing his job. The other sort of example of that is, again, sort of picking up on Google. This was sort of the first time I'd been to the Google campus, and it's so clear how valued the employees are. I mean, how important they take that. Because Google is not a Chevron or an Exxon in the sense of its assets are its people. There's nothing sort of, there's no oil to sell or anything like that. So, you see all this reference to Googlers on every building that you're entering, and then apparently the dogs of Googlers are called Douglers, and then there's references to, this building is Dougler friendly or something like that. And so you can see that this is like in the culture, they keep telling people how important they are, et cetera. And then of course, the world happens around it, and there's the war in the Middle East, and there are some employees that feel very strongly about it, and they want to have these conversations about it. They might feel like Google is not doing enough about it, that Google is perhaps taking sides implicitly in this, and the CEO's response is to say, we're a business, we can't bring that here, right? Now, even if that is the right thing to do, the challenge is that it jars with everything you've been saying about we're a family, and this is our community, and we want you to spend a lot of time here. You can do, there's no reason to leave there. You can do like everything there, right? Like dry cleaning, gym, everything is there. So suddenly to say, oh, we're a business, we can't sort of do this, that is jarring. So even if that's the right answer, the question is, how do you create the conditions where it's the Googlers who say that that's where we need to land? It goes back to this chief medical officer at OUH. He said, even if it's the right answer that we want elective surgeries to continue, how do you get the surgeons to own that? That's the culture I was trying to create, she says that, right? And so you can't then have this diktat from above because it jars with what you've said so far. And now, of course, you run a risk, just like that chief medical officer ran the risk that the surgeons would come to a different decision, right? If you thought the right decision was for the surgeries to continue, and of course the chief medical officer of the UK had sort of run the numbers with the epidemiologists and said, yes, on balance, this is a risk we can take, you need the surgeons to own it. So you need the Googlers to own it. And so how do you create the conditions where they have those conversations on an authentic level and they come to the right decision? And because if they come to the wrong decision, well, then chances are you don't have the right process, or you don't have the right employees, or maybe just as importantly, you're not the right CEO, right? You have to have a sense of perspective that you're the wrong person for this job. And so it's those lessons that we hope people take away from this. And that's why I say it's a book about the process, the how, so that you can get these kinds of conversations surfacing from the bottom up. Because we're living in such a polarized world, right? If it was a homogeneous world, then maybe you can just sort of say, okay, well, this is, I think, what everyone is more or less aligned with.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and very helpful to have those illustrative examples. I guess to flip the perspective a little bit, maybe to that of Googlers or to whoever else is actually working in the organizations themselves. What advice would you give to employees who feel that their organization's stance on an issue or like a particular action that they take goes against their personal values or the values of the company?
Yeah. So because I try. So initially, I thought of this as a management book, and I thought of this as a managerial exercise. But then working with my editor, we figured out that actually it's more about leadership than management. Because, it's not about positional authority. It's about, you can lead from wherever you are in an organization. And it's about personal effectiveness, and it's about sort of trying to figure out how you bring people with you in whatever you think is the important. So in the preface, I say, look, if you're working in a context where you've got these sort of deep divisions and you feel this pressure, how can you be more effective if the way you want to do that is not to deepen the polarization? Because of course there's a way to get things done by making things still more polarized, in the limit resorting to violence. And if that's what you want to do, obviously you don't need to buy the book. It's not very useful. But if you say, okay, if what I'm trying to do is figure out how to get things done, given that we're living in this deeply divided world, then what is the way I do it? And one of the things that the book sort of grapples with, or the framework grapples with, is power. Because power is something that tends to sort of have a pejorative connotation, and because people think if it's something, somehow it's not something they should be embracing. But of course you can't get anything done without power, right? And it's defined in sort of the organizational behavior literature as the potential to mobilize the energy of others to your ends. Okay, so how do you do this in a way that's sort of additive to the organization rather than depletive of the organization. That's one way you can be more effective. And we look at examples of people who have, even from the bottom up, or when they've had to sort of manage upwards, try to do this effectively. And one case that comes to mind is this character called René Brulhard. So René was the first layperson in recent history in the Vatican to be given a direct reporting line to the Pope. And he was basically like the central bank governor of the Pope, of the Vatican. He was brought in basically to oversee the Vatican Bank because there was this sense that there were lots of problems with the Vatican Bank. And he was brought in late in the papacy of the previous Pope, Benedict, and then Benedict resigns, and then Francis is elected Pope, and so forth. So the case is set around that time, and which is a time of great uncertainty, of course, for the Catholic Church as a whole, because the Pope has just resigned, and there's a lot going on, and so forth. And the challenge is that, after 9/11, one of the things that the US Treasury sort of figured out was that there was a lot of illicit capital flowing through the banking system, and we needed to clean that up. And countries like Switzerland and Liechtenstein had to sort of really sort of redo themselves because they were sort of systematically engaged in this kind of what you want to call it, chicanery, money laundering, or just sort of turning a blind eye, depends on your perspective. But so there was that whole cleanup going on. And the Vatican Bank had resisted that, right? So the Vatican Bank had said, well, there's this quote from the case, we're not accountable to you, to the US Treasury, we're accountable to God, right? So now that's that, look, that might be their perspective, but you've got to work with that. And they've made some good arguments. They said, look, during World War II, we were able to get money to the resistance across the lines, right? During the Solidarity movement in Poland, we were able to get money to the dock workers in a way that no other financial institution was. So there's a role for this sort of extra-judicial, extra-institutional type of a bank or financial organization. It's a formal term, is institutes for the work of religion, right? So that's what they were saying, that was the case. But of course, that tribe passed that through the US Treasury. They were not having it. So they had effectively sort of categorized the Vatican Bank as enabling terrorist financing because they didn't meet all of the, and so the Vatican Bank was thrown out of the international banking system, and you couldn't even use a credit card in the Vatican. Now, I didn't realize this until I did this case, but museum sales, museum ticket sales for the Vatican Museum are a huge part of their revenue and income. Because of course they're very rich in terms of assets. They have all these priceless works of art, but they're cash poor. So they need those. And the fact that you couldn't even use a credit card in the Vatican was sort of a source of deep embarrassment. And so the charge to folks like René was, so René, by the way, is a Swiss banker lawyer. And part of what his claim to fame was that he had helped bring Liechtenstein back into the international banking system. So that was why he was brought in. He's Catholic, but he has no sort of clerical basis or anything. So he was brought in, and the Pope gave him, this Pope, Francis, gave him two instructions. They said, you've got to get us back on the banking system, but you can't embarrass the church, right? Now, that might be sort of like seemingly irreconcilable, because of course part of the concern is that if you start saying, well, how did the people with accounts in the Vatican Bank get the money, then you don't have any answers. So you've got to sort of manage upwards. I mean, this guy had, whatever it was at the time, 140 cardinals that he had to manage upward towards, et cetera, because although he had this direct reporting line, he was not even an ordained priest, and so he has no sort of standing in an organization like the Vatican. And he adopts this, you might say a passive approach to sort of that transformation. And he starts holding a series of press conferences where he incrementally commits to what's going to be done, right? And by having this public press conference, he's sort of setting expectations more internally than externally, right? So he uses that external force as a way for accountability. And he's known at the time for having these brutally honest press conferences because he says, yes, 3 months ago I promised you X, I'm 50% of the way there. We haven't made enough, right? And that's the sense in which he's sort of driving the change from within. So to your point about upward management, there are ways in which you can deploy power in a way that is additive. Now, that particular Vatican story has a very sad ending, or actually it's not yet complete, the ending. And I won't go into the details of that, but you can sort of read in the book, or you can Google it, et cetera, and you can see how complex an issue like that can be.
So I think for our last question before we wrap up for questions from the audience, I'd actually like to bring in a personal experience. I have a memory of working from home during COVID, during the January 6 riots, and watching on TV as the news, as protesters were storming the Capitol building. And in that moment, it felt very strange and honestly wrong and alienating to be working on a trivial slide deck due in weeks rather than paying attention to what was going on around me and in the Capitol. I remember mentioning to my manager that it looked like there were riots in the Capitol building and getting the somewhat dismissive response, yeah, politics is crazy. And at the time I felt shocked by that. Of course, we have the election coming up on the 5th, and no matter which side wins, there is sure to be a huge amount of extreme dissatisfaction with the result. So, I'm curious what are perhaps the first things that leaders should do, and maybe at what point does it become impossible for an organization or businesses that seem like they want to become more insulated from politics to actually do that? And at what point do they have to sort of acknowledge what's going on?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And as it pertains to business, I'd say, obviously you can't ignore the context in which you operate, but the specifics of your strategy will depend on what you do, right? So that goes back to what I said about Disney, et cetera. And there's a couple of chapters in the book that talk about, they introduce 7 questions for businesses to ask about how what they do connects with the environment and what they're operating with. And this is not as a replacement for, say, corporate strategy, because obviously the strategy is what it is. Your purpose and your mission and your values are what they are. But here's 7 questions that then help you think about how much to lean in and where to lean in versus not. So there's that. But I think an even more interesting element of your question is what can leaders do in the context of that kind of polarization? Because I think you're dead right. It doesn't matter who wins. We will be a very, very polarized country. And what can we do about that? And it brings to mind one of the people I profile in the book, who's Chris Liddell. And Chris was the CFO of Microsoft. So, Bill Gates is a serious guy. His CFO is probably an even more serious guy, a very, very numbers-driven guy, and that's Chris. He's like as sharp as a lark, very detail focused. And he's sort of this Romney Republican type figure that, he was actually leading the Romney transition, had Romney won in 2012 against Obama. And but of course Romney didn't win, and so Chris went on to other things. I think he became vice chairman of General Motors and so forth. And then of course Trump wins in 2016, and Chris is appointed as the or appointed into the senior administration of the White House. And quite remarkably, so he served as deputy chief of staff of the White House. I think he was smart not to serve as chief of staff because, as you know, there was a very high turnover with chief of staffs or chiefs of staff. But Chris serves as deputy chief of staff, and I think quite remarkably for an appointee in that administration, I think outside of someone named Jared and someone named Ivanka, he was the only person to last all 4 years in the senior leadership of the White House. Most people have never heard of him, right? But that's kind of his secret weapon, that he was someone who obviously, many people might disagree with his politics and so forth, but was incredibly principled and committed to certain things. And one of the things that happens after January 6th is, and actually well before January 6th, Chris starts the transition planning. So he's one of those few people inside the top machinery of the Trump White House that is planning the transition no matter what happens. And after January 6th, he wants to resign because he feels like you on that, like, whoa, what just happened? It's the Biden administration or the Biden incoming team that says, don't you dare resign, right? So they request him, they plead with him to stay on, and Chris is actually one of the last people from the Trump administration in the White House on January 20th, because as you recall, the Trump people had left on the 19th. And he sort of, and then Martha Kumar, who helped run the Biden transition, writes this article called The Man Who Saved America, which is about Chris Liddell. So, in any administration, it will take these kinds of leadership people who embody this kind of leadership. And you hope that in any context, you hope that within the Putin administration, there is a Chris Liddell. You hope that within the next administration, no matter what administration we end up with here, there are people like this, for whom sort of this message around, well, yes, we're in a polarized world, and yes, we're not expecting to radically change our own view, right? I mean, Chris is a conservative, and he espouses conservative things and so forth, but who have a real understanding and a real appreciation for the importance of creating an inclusive process, of keeping people in the conversation as you sort of move your agenda forward. And there are, of course, many other examples of leaders who've done that quite well through history, and that's what we're hoping for, whatever happens in this country.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's an inspiring note to end on, and a lot to think about at a very timely moment. So now we'll move on to audience Q&A.
Thank you. At the beginning, you mentioned how as Americans we have certain truths that we hold as self-evident that you realize not everyone does when you move to your new role. In this more global role, what, if anything, do you no longer view as self-evident?
So do I personally not view as self-evident? Well, I don't think it has changed my perspective or politics. If anything, it's probably moderated me a little because I've seen really smart people hold very different positions than myself. We're very, very lucky that I think every year we have about 30 or 40 Rhodes Scholars. Of the 40 people we bring into the program, we have 30 or 40 Commonwealth Scholars, Chevening Scholars, et cetera. So these are incredibly committed people. But they see the world very differently, and they are pursuing what they see as good government to advance the good life and a good society, but they see the world very differently. And it does humble you, and it does in some sense moderate your most extreme instincts. So there is that, but I mean, my politics are what they are, so I wouldn't say that it's sort of, but one of the things we did in that community, because we had this radical diversity, was to create 3 rules of the game. And these rules of the game had to, a la what we were saying about the chief medical officer, they had to come from the bottom up. They couldn't be things that we sort of dropped onto them. So in the first year we did this, we worked with the student government that was eventually elected to create some first version 1.0 of what these rules of the game would look like, and then every subsequent year people would improve on them. But at the core of them were these 3 principles. The first was, look, we turn down Rhodes Scholars. So there's no state of the world in which we brought you here and don't want you to be able to engage authentically based on what you feel is important. So if you feel like you have to come to this community and censor yourself, then we failed you, because we've turned down some incredibly bright people to bring you here, and we need to hear from you. We need to learn from you. That's rule number 1. Rule number 2 is just the corollary of that, which is just as much as it applies to you, it applies to everybody else here, right? So it can't be just your truth. It has to be that you've created the conditions where others can. But instead of then creating some sort of radical debating society, rule number 3 is what is really important to make this all work, which is we are a leadership community. That what we're trying to build in this institution is a community and a habit of leadership. And that means that we are responsible not just for what we say, but we are responsible for how our words land on others, right? So we take accountability, as a manager would do, as a leader would do, for not just dropping our argument and expecting the people around us to pick up the pieces, but for making people or helping people work through those arguments. That's what a manager or a leader would do. And that takes a lot of work. That requires you to be on in a way that's important, and to your development and to the development of this community to which we are all committed. And it also means we're going to make mistakes. And I, as the leader of this program, will make the most mistakes, right? So that's something that you have to be very upfront about, and that, chances are that they're not going to be malicious. In fact, most likely, over the course of now, I've taught 2,000 students between Harvard and Oxford. I have almost never come across a student that was maliciously engaging in that kind of troublemaking. So let's give people some benefit of the doubt. And you have to sort of create these conditions early on in order to sort of make something like this work. And one of the things we did over the course of the first couple of years, we figured out this was really important, was so on the first day of class, people would usually show up in suits, and because you want to sort of impress your new peers, and this cologne, and you can smell all the cologne around the building. And then on the second day of class, you ask people to come in their gym shorts, right? And we take them to what's called the university tanks, which are these sort of modified swimming pools with rowing boats in them, because rowing is a big deal at Oxford. And you put them in these sort of simulated rowing Olympics. And the reason you don't take them out on the river is not everyone can swim, and that'd be a huge health and safety risk kind of thing, so you don't want to do something like that. But you can, the pool is shallow, so if you fall in, nothing will happen. So you put them in that, and of course it makes for great Insta shots and all that, but what you're doing is you're sort of, you're getting them to sweat together. And that's really important because you learn to be vulnerable from day one, right? Remember, we're all going to make mistakes. And so let's sort of sweat together, let the cologne wear off, and let's sort of like start from that. And two, the nice thing about rowing is you can't be the fastest person in your boat. You have to learn to time and pace yourself with the 7 other people in the boat. And let's say you've randomized this with people from the US and China, from Russia and Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, India, Pakistan, and you have to learn to pace yourself with everybody in that boat, right? So these sorts of activities are really important to seeding that culture very early on. And one of the themes in the book is you have to create the conditions that will allow you to deal with polarization before you're dealing with polarization, right? So in the first 2-3 weeks of the program is what I call the honeymoon period. That's where you can get a lot of this seeded in, because by the time you get to week 4 or 5, the politics will come up, right? I mean, that's why they're there. These are incredibly bright, committed people who want to change the world, and they will have differences in politics, and that's why the school exists. So, but use that honeymoon period to start building that trust, because you're going to need it later on. And that's true with any business. It's true with any government. It's true with any, right? There are some other cases outside of Oxford that we can talk to if we have time. But.
Going back to your medical example, and never events, I was working at Kaiser Permanente late last century when the issue in Santa Clara County was ER closures, which is a never event.
Yes.
And I was the director of organization development. So, everybody was pointing fingers at each other. And the insight that I got from you was that whereas what the medical director Oxford was doing as a prevention, I was already in the middle of this. And so what do you do when you have these ER closures and everybody's pointing their fingers?
Yeah.
And we had the inspiration to use an after-action review methodology that was triggered because there was no way I could get people to a regular meeting to solve this.
No.
But we were able to, what happened at 8 o'clock in the morning after the ER closed, everybody had to be at this meeting and look at why it happened, and just what was the intention, what happened, and blah, blah, blah. And that really helped. This was Santa Clara Kaiser, and then we extended it to other places, and we really helped deal with that incident. So the insight, I never thought about using it from a prevention, which is what she did, but the after-action review as a process, when you have a situation that's going on, and you have to empower the people to figure it out, because every single one, it was a different reason. One of the main things was taxis.
Yeah.
We couldn't get people out of the ER because you couldn't get people out of the med-surg unit because you couldn't get them out, it's the whole system, out of the ICU, and they were waiting for a taxi.
That's a really good point, and in some sense I say there's a circularity to the framework, and you can join anywhere in that, right? Because sometimes you join when, the thing is already boiling, and what do you do then? That's where the turning down the temperature is the first step of it, and then you say, okay, where do I go from there? It reminds me of the situation faced by the Metropolitan Commissioner of Police in London, Cresta Dick. She was the first woman in that role, also the first LGBT person in that role, and she had been a 40-year veteran of the police, and so she was seen in some sense, not that this was her identity, but she was expected to be seen as this sort of liberal, progressive leader, et cetera. So there were a lot of expectations and weight on her. And then in the pandemic, there was some data released that suggested that stop and search, which in this country is called stop and frisk, was at an all-time high, and that if you were a young black man in London, you were 16 times more likely to be stopped than if you're white, right? So this is a huge issue. And then shortly after that, George Floyd is murdered here. And so then there are these anti-policing protests, et cetera. And suddenly Cresta Dick is her name, is dealing with this sort of crisis, and she's got to figure out what to do. And The Guardian is running these articles about how she needs to call out the police as being institutionally racist. Of course, the police at the time was, London police was 85% white in a city that's about 50% white. So one of the risks she ran was if she used the term institutionally racist, she would alienate the police force. So she couldn't afford to do that because we were in the middle of this pandemic. There was all the other things going on. And part of the other problem she faced was the Met Police Commissioner in London has two bosses, the Mayor of London and the Home Secretary, which is sort of like the Attorney General in this country. And they were very different political persuasions. The Mayor of London is still the same mayor, Sadiq Khan, who is a sort of left-leaning Labour Party. And the Home Secretary at the time was a woman called Priti Patel, who's very sort of made Boris Johnson look moderate. So, and they were openly criticizing her in the media, right? On both sides. So she was dealing with all this. And one of the things she recognized was, who are the catalytic forces in this sort of, and how to bring them around the table, right? Now, eventually she ends up losing her job because the situation, the crisis after crisis after crisis. But in the immediate crisis that she was managing, she realized that the Met Black Police Officers Association was absolutely crucial to have on board, right? If you're going to sort of bring the temperature under control, yes, you have to keep the police officers union on board, which is largely white. You have to keep the anti-stop and search activist communities on board, which were sort of riled up. There were all of these anti-policing protests that were openly violating the social distancing orders. And then there was a lot of pushback from people who had lost loved ones during the pandemic and said, I couldn't even go to my funeral and you're not stopping this anti-policing protest, what the hell? So she has to deal with all this, right? And she brings in the head of the Met Black Police Officers Association as a way to sort of manage that, right? And so oftentimes in these situations, you've got to understand who are the catalytic forces. They might be institutions, they might be individuals, and they are extremely important to that first stage of de-escalation, right? Because if you lose that, if you lose the Met Black Police Officers this year, you're finished. You might as well resign, because then there's no way out of something like that. And so it's, and of course it depends on which situation you're in. Yeah.
Hi, Karthik. I'm Sandeep. I actually have so I was at Meta before this. I was Facebook working on the integrity team during the US 2020 elections. So Jan 6 was a very different day for us, having seen the actual people who were doing it from Facebook. Harking back to Nicholas Taleb's concept of anti-fragility. Our team, even though we were working crisis constantly in polarization, and we went on to work, I went on to work multiple other elections and crisis events. Yes, I was in demand for working in a polarized place, but our team was suffering from a lot of burnout. We were all this very cynical, very jaded individuals at the end of it. That's why I came to Stanford to relax. But
right, because the MBA program is such an easy.
Yeah, but my question is what are your thoughts on the idea of creating an anti-fragile culture? Not one that necessarily invites polarization crisis, but can benefit and grow and become more robust with each event of polarization. And how do you, as a leader, how do you promote that in a way that is sustainable?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, and in fact, the last two chapters in the book are about that. The theme of resilience I talk about, and both at the individual level and at the organizational level, right? You've got to think about it at both. At the individual level, it's interesting. Many of the protagonists we profiled in the case studies in the book, I asked them this question about, what are some of your favorite readings on from philosophy or from the humanist traditions on resilience, and the Stoics was something that came up. Now, Stoicism gets a bad rap in sort of modern academic philosophy because it's sort of seen as not as conceptually rigorous as some of the other classical Greek traditions. And then, of course, in popular culture, it might be misunderstood as sort of this, almost clinical indifference, right, to emotional sort of unintelligence. And but what sort of the best conception of Stoicism that I've heard is the idea of dialectical sophistication, right? So being careful about what you say and how you engage, and having a sense of perspective on what it is you can and cannot control, right? And it's interesting that the leaders who sort of navigated this fairly successfully had sort of been reading Stoicism or somehow following Stoic writings, even modern day Stoic writings, even if not in the original classical traditions, because they recognized how much of this was outside their control and how they needed to keep themselves sane in that context. On an organizational level, perhaps the piece of reading that most struck me was a paper written by two of my colleagues, Rebecca Henderson at Harvard and Bob Gibbons at MIT, on something called relational contracts, which is just a way economists talk about, in some sense, the need for creating cultures where you can delegate to people, where you can train people to have good judgment, to exercise that delegation thoughtfully, and then eventually where you have the capacity and the trust to allow them to fail. Because, yes, there are organizations that delegate, but often they fail to train people how to use that delegation wisely. And even if they do those two things, when things do go wrong, they punish people for making mistakes. And all three of those things are necessary to build resilience. And how, again, organizations that have done that have been, because then there are many people that are able to sort of address this. And sort of a closing thought is a quote I came across that was the advice given by Dwight Eisenhower to Jack Kennedy just before Kennedy took the oath of office. So Kennedy was youngest person elected president, and Eisenhower was this great World War general, 5 stars and all that. And so Kennedy asked him for advice, and Eisenhower says, no easy matter should ever come to you as president. If it is easy, it should be settled at a lower level, right? And Eisenhower is saying two things there. One, he's saying, be prepared for how tough this job is, but also create an organization that you're not receiving 200 emails every 30 minutes, right? That, of course, there were no emails at the time, but you can't centralize it that way. And so that's a sort of useful thought for us to, I guess, leave this with, which is that on resilience.
Great. Well, I hope you all join me in thanking Karthik for a wonderful talk.
And thank you.